great delight that we introduce Professor Andrew Gerber, who is a graduate of the first MSc course that was run back in.
That's right.
And is now a director of the MRI research program at New York State University, New York State Psychiatric Institute, and assistant professor in the Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry at Columbia University Medical Center. But really interestingly, is bringing together and integrating the neuroscience and developmental lines, which is again, I think, testament to the spirit of the MSc in bringing together different types of data. So over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Ali. So it's I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to have been invited back. Oh, sorry, that's and to be here. It literally is 21 years since I started my MSc. I was part of the first class in 93, 94. And so the center has changed in drastic ways, but also is very much the same place. And it's exciting and gratifying to be back. I'm going to interpret this idea of review of the last 20 years a bit loosely today, because we only have about a half an hour for me to talk. And I'm going to try to break what I think is another tradition of the MSc, or at least of the last two speakers, because I'm the same way, of filling the entire time, but I'm going to try to leave about 15 minutes at the end so that we can talk and have questions and so on. So I couldn't resist, and I had to start with some pictures. So this is a picture that, I know it's a little hard to see with the lights on, but this is a picture that is very near and dear. I don't know if people can see, but there's our fearless leader, Fonagy, back there. This is Joe Sandler, who is an enormously important person in my life, with Anne-Marie right behind him. You guys will recognize Miriam Steele and Howard Steele. There's Roz, just hiding behind Anne-Marie. There I am, looking 21 years younger. Anna, Peter's wife, Anna, Hannah Cantor, who was in my class from the first year, Susie Orbach, who was a friend, and Mary, Jeffrey Baruch, who I'm sure some of you know, and this person you probably don't know that well, but that's Claire Welch, who was Peter's assistant, and who was a wonderful person, and her boyfriend, husband is taking this picture, Gerald, and he was I think, the first IT manager of the Anna Freud Center when there was no IT, so it wasn't that hard a job. And Gerald was the second. So it's very exciting to see that now there's a lot of IT here. So that's fun. So that's 94. But I have some other pictures as well. So there's Peter when the hair hadn't quite come away. Where's Peter? I don't see him. Oh, okay, sure. See, he hadn't quite given up on it yet. This is Howard and his daughter Gabrielle, who's now, I think, 20 at least. Well, I know. And this is Christina Orwitz, who's a class below me. Can anybody figure out who she's with there? That's our cameraman. That's Francisco. That's the truth. And there's Hannah and her family and her daughters. So as I was looking through some of the pictures, Peter mentioned in his talk this morning that sometimes one can forget aggression. And you see, and as a master's student and then later a PhD student with Peter, I'm reminded that there were some aggressive moments. So this is the truth. This is the picture I had on my hard drive. I had colored out one of his teeth. And this is also true that I had some pictures. You may remember this, that I had edited as a joke, but I couldn't find the originals. All I could find was the edited one. That's all. That's John Cross, who you guys don't know, but was a master's student the year after me. And that was, I can't remember, Mary Ann, she was from Greece, who was also the year after. Ingi remembers, who was also the year after me. So that was 20 years ago, and so this is how we would like to be 20 years later. I think this picture of Peter kind of fits, and for me, this is my Google Glass, by the way. So I would like to see myself 20 years later, but in fact, I don't know if you can see it, but this is my daughter Samantha, who in the tradition of pedagogy, which maybe at some point we'll get Peter to explain, isn't only listening, but is in fact telling me I'm wrong all the time. So so somehow we have to fit that into the tradition of learning as well, that you challenge and you disagree with your teachers. All right. So let's get to some of the substance now. And I thought we would start by talking a little bit about the developmental lines themselves, because this was a fun chance for me to go back and look at some of this work that had been so important to me in the development of my own thinking, and that I learned right here in this building and across the street. So Anna Freud, in her 1965 book, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, started with a prototype of a developmental line. And this is how she described it: from dependency to emotional self-reliance and adult-object relationships. And then she gave several examples of these. She didn't interestingly say that she had the comprehensive list, which I thought was interesting. But she said that here are some of those lines that you would want to think about, and even illustrated some of those pathways. So she talked about from bodily dependence to independence and gave some examples of that. She talked about from egocentricity to companionship, from the body to the toy, and from play to work. So clearly sort of setting the tone and the stage for what she was most interested in, but not enumerating all of them, because in fact I think she would have acknowledged that we didn't know all the ways that development gets spelled out over the lifespan. So what I remembered then was, and this I don't know how much is still in the MSc course, but it was certainly a very important part to our training, was Mary and Peter at the time had just been developing the HCAM. I don't know if are people familiar with the HCAM? The HCAM is the Hampstead Child Adaptation Measure, and it was a measure that really emerged from Mary Target's own PhD thesis, where in looking at the outcome of all those cases from the Anna Freud Center treatment over the years, this massive retrospective analysis, which in some ways I think fundamentally showed people that you could do good empirical research in this population and in this treatment. She knew that the available measures for looking at change and development were inadequate. So Mary constructed, based on Anna Freud's developmental lines, a 15-scale set of measurements. And I was fortunate enough to get to work a little bit with this and to help write out some of the operationalized list of criteria for adolescents. So I actually had the original file on my hard drive. I found it and was able to write down what those 15 are. And it's really interesting because they take Anna Freud's lines and they take it to that next step of really building it into an operationalizable scale. So there are things that you're all going to be very familiar with: ability to take care of body, ability to learn and work. These are very explicitly in Anna Freud. But now they go a little bit further. Frustration tolerance, impulse control, relationships with parents or caretakers, siblings, peers, adults, level of confidence and self-esteem, capacity to cope with stress, general mood and its variability, sexual development, play, hobbies and interests, moral responsibility, resilience of physical health under stress, and very interestingly, given both of the last two talks, ability to adapt to changed circumstances. So I think really already back in 93, 94, Peter and Mary very clearly had a roadmap of the kinds of things that we needed to be able to study and think about if we were to sort of move forward in this very powerful metapsychology view of development and the evolving mind. Now the question though is, what does one do with that? And you can hear the struggle, I think, in all of us, and maybe as you see my role now, the role that I'm paid for is to run an MRI unit at Columbia. How do we take these concepts, these powerful psychological ideas that in some sense have existed even before 93, they go back to Anna Freud's work in the 60s, how do we translate that into a world that is using new neurobiological genetics techniques to study things at this very fundamental level? I mean, one can make the argument that, well, let's keep them separate. Let's just study things at the psychological level. You guys go ahead, study them at the neural level, and we'll each do our own thing. And I think to some extent we have to accept that there is this, these parallel separate pathways. But on the other hand, we live in a real world now where that's not enough, where major academic departments of psychology and psychiatry will be interested in the psychological phenomenon to the extent that one can link them up to these other more fundamental biological processes. And I think that's both a check on our psychological thinking. It forces us to ground it in these fundamental measures. It shouldn't be a total constraint in the sense that it doesn't mean there aren't important theories. I'm trained as a psychoanalyst. I see patients several times a week. I believe in the necessity of thinking at this more psychological level, not just with my patients, but in my research as well. But I live in a world where I need to try to link these up in a powerful way. And I would argue that as long as our ideas are good, and I believe they are, they're going to be linked up. So in that regard, I love this quote from Philip Dick. I don't know if anybody knows him. He's a science fiction writer who wrote actually some very popular books that were turned into movies and so on. But this is my favorite quote of reality. He says, reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, it doesn't go away. And in this context, I'm going to use that to talk about the ideas of Anna Freud and the developmental lines. In other words, these are such real ideas. These are such good ideas that even if the world puts it aside and stops believing in it, it will keep coming back. Because this, in fact, is how children develop, according to these very complex, interesting lines. And we're going to find it seeping into whatever good science and psychology and psychiatry that we do. And in fact, I think we're at a very exciting time in psychiatry and psychology right now where some of these ideas are coming back. The trick is to recognize it and recognize the opportunity that we have to make that interface. And I think the work we've heard earlier today can be seen in that light as linking up to the opportunities that we now have, particularly when it comes to funding opportunities for doing research. So let's start with stuff that may be obvious to you, but interestingly wasn't always obvious to the world of psychiatry. And so, for example, one of those is the idea of gene-environment interactions, right? So I think if we went back and asked Anna Freud, do you think that the equipment that the child is born with has an important interaction with the environment? I think she'd regard that as so obvious, might not even be worth saying. But in fact, the world of psychiatry and psychology have often swung in the direction of so emphasizing the genetics and the genes that it gets hard to remember how important the environment is. And I think then we are in danger, and the field of psychoanalysis has often been in danger, of in reaction swinging the other way. And saying, you guys are so insistent on this nonsense about genes that we're going to take the opposite extreme position and say it's all about the environment. And in fact, it's about both. And this is one of the classic experiments, in the recent history. This is published by Avshalom Caspi in 2003 in Science, showing that if you wanted to predict who in this large population is going to develop depression, it's not enough to know their genetic predisposition, and it's not enough to know what he's calling stressful life events in this kind of crude analysis. You need to know both, right? Maybe that's obvious, but it was unobvious enough that it was a featured article in Science in 2003, which doesn't tend to publish obvious things, and still cited widely within the worlds of psychology and psychiatry. Another example of this, and again, you may say, well, I figured something like that was going on. I didn't know it was exactly that mechanism, but something like that had to be going on, is this notion of epigenetics. And this is something that you see everywhere within the world of psychology and psychiatry today. And that's the notion that we now understand at least some of the mechanisms by which experience alters genetic expression. Right? At the very basic level of what proteins are produced as a result of a genetic code being a fairly fixed an inherited readout. But even at the level of how that gets translated into a protein, there are important environmental influences. So this is seen now in mice and in rats who are exposed to different maternal behaviors. We can now see things like effects on the methylation patterns. In other words, this addition of a simple chemical group to the gene, to the DNA, that affects how it gets read out. And people are studying this now at an intense level. Now you might say, well, that's still fairly concrete relative to the nuances of what we think about in terms of environment, and that's true. But the fact that there's movement in that direction, to me, is an opportunity for us to move towards them, and epigenetics is really an exploding area of research for us to engage with. The last thing I'll put in that category, and I could spend the whole time just talking about these opportunities, but the one that's extremely important in the United States right now, and I would imagine, you guys can tell me how much it's affected things here in the UK, but I imagine it's one of those ideas that may well be kind of contagious, is this notion of the research domain criteria, or RDoC. Just out of curiosity, who's heard about RDoC? Raise your hand if it's something you're familiar with. So that's interesting to me that it's so few here in the US, here in the UK. In the US, even in a psychology group, it would be almost everybody, in the sense that this is just part of the political discourse now, is engaging with this new mandate that's been issued really almost totally top-down in the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, coming from Tom Insel, who's the long-term director of the National Institutes for Mental Health. And what he says, again, it's to the point that when I tell you, you may say, duh, we've known something like this all along, and you didn't even do a particularly good job at saying it. But nonetheless, it's quite revolutionary. What Tom Insel has said is, forget these ridiculous categories that we have in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM. Mental illness does not sort itself into these neat categories. Clinicians have known this, researchers have known this. Let's stop with this sort of delusion of these categories, and let's start to identify what are the continuous variables that describe people, and describe them in theory, all the way from their genetics, all the way up to the nuances of the clinical situation. So he created this matrix. And the matrix has columns that he calls units of analysis, and take you all the way from genes, molecules, cells, circuits. I have a bit bigger here. Genes, molecules, cells, circuits, physiology, behavior, self-reports, and paradigms. Paradigms being how you actually test some of these things in a more clinical situation. Right? Those are the columns. And then the rows are essentially, at this point, guesses as to what some of these continuous variables might be. Now, am I now going to read the 15 HCAM axes or the developmental lines? No, we're not quite there yet. But you'll see a surprising a similarity in some of them, which to me, again, is this kind of an opportunity. So let me read out some of these things. And they sound bad at first. They sound very concrete and cognitive. But the more you get into the nuances of them, I think you'll see that there are potentials for overlap. He starts with these things called the negative valence systems: active threat, passive threat, sustained threat, loss. That doesn't sound so good to me yet. That's not one of my favorite categories, okay? Positive valence systems, approach motivation, initial responsiveness to reward. I'm starting to get a little better here. For example, habit being one of them. Habit being a term that's very popular now, despite it being a somewhat simple term, and refers to a lot of implicitly learned behaviors, including, by the way, a lot of social behaviors, and even what might be included in some of the terms Peter used earlier, like internal working models and so on. And then we get down to cognitive systems. Now, the first reaction a lot of people have to the word cognitive, which I think would be historically accurate, is to see cognition as cold and not involving the affect, the relationships, the drama, the unconscious that we all learned to see as so important to human motivation, to human mental life, and to development. Well, it turns out the term cognition is changing. That's not what people mean by it anymore. More and more, the term cognition is a broad, overarching term to mean mental functioning that includes affect and social relationships and so on. So even though their system starts with attention, perception, declarative memory, look at the last one. Under cognitive control, which again sounds very conscious and online, They say representation and maintenance of representations. So we got the word representation in there already. That's an important start, because once you've got the concept of representation, you've got all the things that a representation brings with it. And it's not hard then to think that once you have a representation, you have affect, you have motivation, you have a narrative story, particularly when that representation is more language or semantically based and in older and more mature individuals. Now we get to the really promising categories. Even beyond that, there's a system for social processes, affiliation and attachment. That word is used on the NIH website. Social communication, perception and understanding of self, perception and understanding of others, in parentheses, understanding mental states. There he is. Fonagy has made it into our doc. That's a big deal. That is a big deal, that we are part of a larger idea about how to approach. I mean, it's not just a larger idea, it's a $500 million idea, because the NIMH's budget is on the order of $500 million. So this is per year. These are resources going into the studying of psychology and development. That's a real possibility for all of us. Okay. So how do we put this together? I mean, it sounds, I think, politically okay. It sounds like we have this opportunity, but what do we do about it? Do we just sort of go on doing what the kind of research we've been doing all along? Well, at least we're doing research. That's a step forward. I agree. But is there a way to link things up? And the argument that I want to make, and I'll make it briefly because I'm going to run out of time pretty soon. How much time do I have left, Avi?
We've got about 7-8 minutes.
7-8 minutes. Is that this concept of representation really is at the core of what we want to do. It's at the core of what Anna Freud was talking about when she said from dependency to emotional self-reliance in adult-object relationships. In other words, she was talking about the way we represent ourselves and others. And it's a word that actually can translate into so many other different terms that are valuable all the way from infancy, at birth even, up through adulthood. If we're okay making that translation, and we make an effort to use the language of the audience we're talking to as opposed to only sticking within our individual language, I would argue that we can use that word representation interchangeably at times with internal working model, with schema. I think you heard a couple people talk about schemas earlier on today, with attachment classification or attachment pattern, and maybe even a little broader with some of the more neuroscience-oriented terms. And I'll give you one that you probably haven't heard about called perceptual symbol systems. Let me go ahead a little bit. So this is Lawrence Barsalou here at Carnegie Mellon, who does computational modeling of representation. He doesn't call it representation, he calls them perceptual symbol systems. Sounds bizarre and a little arcane. It's the same basic idea. How do we represent the complexity of reality in that way? And by the way, there's an old tradition of people trying to do this thing even outside the psychoanalytic world. You could say Kant we talked about representations and schemas in a very basic perceptual way. Piaget certainly did in his thinking about accommodation and assimilation. And Frederick Bartlett here in the UK did this as well and used the term schemas for that. So let me go back a little bit, because sometimes one of the hardest things for us to do is to come up with the right metaphor. We use metaphors in our work all the time, but let me propose a metaphor that I think helps you get your head around the challenge of what the brain/mind has to do with representation, and also where it can go wrong. So this is an old New Yorker cartoon that is very familiar to anybody in New York City. I'm sure less so over here. The title, I know it's a little hard to see, the title is A New Yorker Looks West from 9th Avenue. And if you look at it, up front here, it's from 1976. Up front, you have enormous amounts of detail. If you look at 9th Avenue, look at even the block to 10th Avenue, you see every car, every street lamp, every person in great detail. But as you cross the Hudson River and you're looking west, things become much more schematic. New Jersey is there, but it's a kind of featureless strip. It's just kind of there. When you pass New Jersey, you see nothing all the way to Kansas City. Okay, so you're skipping over a lot of states and a lot of people. Chicago is somewhere up there, Texas is somewhere over there, but then you skip a lot of the country again till you get to Las Vegas and parts of California. And then You skip the whole Pacific Ocean, and the three countries, you definitely can't see this, you see are, this is the 70s, China, Russia, and Japan. Nothing else, right? And obviously it's parodying the American view of the world, particularly at this point in time. But I would argue, and this isn't just being an apologist for being a New Yorker, that in some way or shape, we all have to do something like this all the time. There's too much detail in the world, particularly in our social worlds, by the way, for us to be veridically representing every detail. If I had to remember and think about every facial expression, every person in this room, I would be completely overwhelmed and run off the stage screaming, right? But I can represent who's in the audience and still pay enough attention that I know who's here. Now, the opposite extreme could be I could have no awareness of who's in the audience at all, and that also wouldn't be adaptive. There's got to be something in the middle. And most important of all, I have to be able to shift when I need to. So right now, you can be I can represent you as a group of former MSc students of an approximate age and level of background. But if I start to have a one-on-one conversation with one of you, I have to now inhibit that view of everybody else, because that's not relevant, and focus on the details of what's being said to me. And we all know, and it's not just psychopathology, sometimes it's just personality, people who don't do that very well, who don't pay attention to the details, who aren't listening to you, or people who don't pay attention to large groups. But you think about the necessity of moving back and forth in this complex way. It's actually been illustrated by how often that cartoon has been reproduced in other countries. There's China sees the world, the Dutch see the world, Atlanta, Tel Aviv, and my favorite one, you can't see it, but this is, it says how Sarah Palin sees the world. And all it says is Alaska everywhere. So, you know. So the idea being that there are obviously ways that we can do this wrong, right, in either direction, but it's something we have to do in terms of our representations. So I'm going to wrap up now by giving you an example of how one can, I think, do an experiment and actually get down to the level of neuroscience and maybe even access neuroscience measures that we can then turn back to psychodynamic psychotherapy and think about how those change in response to therapy. So really referencing back to Peter's question about how do we think about, and it's no coincidence that of course he got that idea from me, that's why he said the other way around. You know, this idea that it's just implausible that psychoanalysis has the one right answer to all psychotherapy questions, and of course it would be your particular school of psychoanalysis, and everybody else is wrong. There are many ways to do psychotherapy, many good ways to do psychotherapy, and the question isn't how to show we're right and everybody else is wrong, but how to find these commonalities and really use those to build even better psychotherapies that are more appropriate. So that's really where I want to go. But to get there, we need to understand better what it is about how representations change and how that system that I just illustrated with the New Yorker cartoon really works. So let me give you one example of that, and then I'll stop. So this is an experiment that we did based on the work of a cognitive psychologist or social psychologist named Susan Anderson at NYU. And this is how the experiment goes. Susan interviews, she uses college students, and tells them that it's a one-off experiment. It's just an interview. She wants them to talk about important people in their lives. So she says for each person who comes in the room, she says, tell me about 4 important people. People typically pick parents, siblings, significant others, caretakers, and so on. And for each one of those 4, give me 10 short sentences describing something good about them, and 10 short sentences saying something negative about them. So all she has them do about that, there's some other kind of details around which I won't bother you with right now, but more or less she gets that data, sends them on their way, tells them the experiment is over. Unbeknownst to the participant, she actually has a plan. Several months later, they get invited back to an experiment that they are misled to believe is unrelated to the first, okay? It's done in a different building with a different experimenter, a different name. And in this second experiment, and I'm going to tell you about our variant of it because we do it in the MRI scanner. She didn't, but we, with her collaboration, adapted it for the MRI scanner. They're told, we're going to put you in the scanner, and we're going to tell you about some real people who you don't know, and we're just going to ask you to remember these descriptions. We're testing your memory of strangers, okay? Now, you can already imagine we're up to some kind of a trick here. And the trick is the following. Of the 12 people that we're going to teach them about, 4 of them in random order with different names, have been made to resemble the 4 significant others that they had told us about several months before. Amazingly, you can use the exact words they said, as long as you strip off the name, and people don't actually realize that, wait a second, this is actually my own language, because people tend to forget these things, and for them, it's just their common language, so there's no reason to assume that other people don't use the same. We also, by the way, don't use all of the descriptors. We save some, we keep some in reserve, and I'll explain to you why. So of those 12, 4 resemble their significant others, 4 are just a mishmash of descriptors of famous people, and then 4 actually resemble somebody else's significant others. So if Saul and I were both in the experiment together, I would learn about 4 people, someone who resembles my mother, for example, but I'd also learn about someone who resembles Saul's mother, and he would learn the same too. We're sort of linked in this way, except the personal relevance would be reversed. So this is what it looks like in the scanner, and then this is how we test the response. We start to show them sentences and say, for each sentence we show you, tell us, is this something you had learned about this quote-unquote stranger? And you can imagine what we're looking for, which is we're trying to trick them in a very specific way. Some of the sentences we show them, and we call them lures, are taken from their own descriptions of these significant others. But we did not use them. This is what I was talking about keeping things in reserve. We did not teach them about the stranger. So if we're right that their representation, their schema, their transference pattern of this stranger is built upon this important developmentally learned idea of what is this person like, my mother, my father, my sister, then they are going to be more likely to mix in and to identify that sentence as having been taught to them when in fact it wasn't. But of course we have a nice control condition because the theory goes, I should do that about a stranger who resembles my mother, but I shouldn't do that about a stranger who resembles Saul's mother. There may be some generic mother patterns that I'm familiar with, but there should be something, certainly in our theory, that says that there's something even more valenced, even more important, and listen, if you go back to theories and Gerger's idea, even more adaptive about having learned your particular environment, about how this mother person is. And sure enough, it's been shown behaviorally now, both by Susan over many experiments and by us, that you get this behavioral pattern outside of awareness. People don't remember. We grill them afterwards to see if they figured out the design. They don't. But they do exactly as we would expect it. That is, they fill in and are more likely to think that they were taught something that they in fact were not. But here's the final piece, and this is where things start to get very exciting for me. We have them in the scanner when we do it, and we can start to see what we believe to be the neural patterns of this use of these internal working models. We really have 2 main analyses now, and we're working on getting this published. One that shows activation or differential activation in the anterior cingulate, which is a region that many of you may know has historically been this is the subgenual anterior cingulate, been linked up to emotion regulation and to depression. And here it shows up in a task that has nothing to do with at least explicitly with emotion or to do with depression. We see this differential activity. So for example, it makes one wonder, are we starting to see a possibility that emotion regulation is actually intrinsically relationally based? An idea that I think clinically we've been there for a long time, but in terms of neuroscience literature had really not made it there. But the other region that we see in a very important differential way is this region called the fusiform cortex, and the inferior temporal cortex, which is a region that's long been thought of as being a face region. And there's an old literature that says that. But it turns out, in fact, and we're just one of many studies now to have shown this, that it's not exclusively a face region. We, in fact, don't show faces at all in this experiment, yet get differential activity in the fusiform. And the new suggestion really is that this is an area of expertise. So what are we experts in? Well, we're experts in people. And we're experts in particular in people like my mother and my father, and how new people I meet are similar or dissimilar, and how I interact with them. So this is just the beginning. for a variety of reasons, one area that we've taken this into more recently is into autism. A lot of that's practical. There's a lot of buzz, there's a lot of money in autism research right now. And we can show, for example, that these patterns do not appear in high-functioning autistic individuals, even with the same IQ, which suggests that their social deficits are really rooted in something about their capacity to form, and I would actually argue, to change the representations. That back to that flexibility idea that I think is embedded in the metaphor of the New Yorker cartoon, but is also embedded in Peter's description of this ability to constantly adapt what one is learning to new environments. So I'm going to stop there. I have a little bit more data about how this applies to psychotherapy, but we can always come back to it. I want to thank a bunch of important people. Brad Peterson, who was my boss and who really introduced a lot of these ideas to me, who's now moving to University of California, Los Angeles. Susan Anderson, who worked with us, and Kevin Ochsner, who's a cognitive neuroscientist at Columbia, but very open to these ideas. I've been fortunate to get funding from a range of places. And as all of you know, and I learned first and foremost here, you can't do this work alone. You need big teams of people. And who do I like best? I like master students best, because that's what I learned. And so that's my schema, but I also think it's just right. The master students are pretty awesome. And so these are almost all of the master students who I've worked with in New York and who've made these studies possible. And then finally, my own daughters, Samantha and Lila, who are pretty important to me. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Do we have time for just a couple of questions?
I think we have a couple of questions, yeah.
Andrew, I was wondering, did you see any difference when you filled in negative, positive information?
It's a good question. So we haven't done those analyses yet, and I could speculate. I think that the negative, positive neuroscience stuff is a little bit overdone, because I don't think the brain is predominantly organized that way. The brain wants information, and it doesn't have a region it stores good things and a region it stores bad things. But you're right, we have the data to test that.
I was wondering if the negative one will involve more emotion and
I see what you mean. That's a very interesting question. Right, and I guess it's ultimately a scaling question too, because how do we decide is a good use of a master student. I'll tell you what I need. I need somebody to go through my descriptors, because remember, we collect 4 times 20, so 80, and I have about over 100 subjects now, so that's 8,000 descriptors. That's an MSc project, right? And I need somebody to go through and rate how strongly negative and positive, and see the relation. But that's a great idea, and interesting.